Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mark Buckhalter. I'm a member of CARG, or Community Association Resource Group. It's a group basically that caters to associations, and we have various disciplines, all that have been vetted. Basically, very quickly, and then we'll introduce everybody at the end of Will's presentation. But basically, we have accounting, that's what I do. We have banking, cable consulting. We have ServPro, which is water and mold remediation. We have condo insurance, janitorial services, light maintenance, landscaping, paving, pool services, public adjuster, roofing. We also have a new member that does pest control, and obviously Jeff Solomon, who does a lot of the marketing and Zoom preparation for us. So I really wanted to go ahead and just thank everybody for joining. And I want to just turn it over to Will, who will go ahead and give his presentation. I personally know Will for, I don't know, we were just talking about it, for a good 5-6 years at least.
Yeah.
And he's probably the premier reserve specialist. So Will, I'll leave it in your hands, and then we'll get back to everybody when you're finished.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Will Simons. Pleasure to be with you. While we're doing our intro here, I'll say hello on camera, but I will be turning that camera off during the presentation, just to give everybody a chance to focus on the slides. We've got a lot of good content for you today. Thanks again to CARG for putting this on. I think these types of educational events are fantastic, especially at this time of the year with potentially new legislation coming. It's budget season. There's just a lot happening in the association and world out there. So I appreciate the opportunity to work with you guys. Thank you. Talk a bit more about it in just a moment. But today's class is called Fundamentals of Reserves. Class should run for about an hour. As Jeff indicated, we will have time for that Q&A at the end. But yeah, just to echo what he said, we often get way more questions than we have time to answer. So I will do my best to get through all those. If I see that multiple people are asking the same question, we'll try to scroll through those and answer those kind of as a group if we can, but we'll do our best. I always try to give this quick reminder just in case there's any technical difficulties. That did happen to me once earlier this year where my internet service went down in the building. So if that happens, don't panic, stay tuned, stay in the meeting. I will try to get back in as soon as I can and rejoin everybody. Yeah, I guess last reminder for today, for all the CAMs that are in attendance, we will be reporting your course credits to the DBPR. Usually we get those done within about a week or so. So don't panic if you don't see that posted tomorrow, but within the next week or so, we should get all those credits posted for you. So thank you again for joining. I will stop the video now and we'll get started here in just a moment. Okay, well, hello again. Thank you for joining Fundamentals of Reserves. Today's class is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit in either the insurance and financial management section or as an elective. If you haven't already provided your first name, last name, and CAM license number, please be sure to do so along with your email address. I think by virtue of having registered for this, we should already have that, but just in case, most importantly, there would be the CAM license number for those of you who want to get credit for today's class. Now, with that said, I always try to point out, I don't want to give the impression that this course is only for managers, board members, committee members, residents, anybody else who's tuning in today. Everybody should be able to get a great deal of knowledge about reserve budgeting and planning and come away better prepared to lead and serve the communities that you work with. I'll set it up with Jeff, but we'll be happy to send out copies of the slides for the presentation. So don't feel that you need to ask for that. We'll just preemptively send the slides to everybody. And I think Jeff, along with a recording of the session as well. So, take notes as we go along, but don't feel that you need to scramble to catch every last detail. Do I have that right, Jeff?
That's correct. We'll have the link for the video and the slides on the carg4help.org website within a couple of days.
Beautiful. Thank you, sir. Okay, before I get into the material, I'll take just a moment to introduce myself and our company in a little more detail. My name again, Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008 now. I spent most of my career in Florida. We've had clients in Florida going back to the early 1990s. The RS after my name, that stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry-specific credential that's only awarded to people who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. It comes from CAI, the Community Associations Institute. I'm sure quite a few of you out there are members of CAI. There's only been a few hundred people who have ever earned that credential going back over the last 20 plus years or so. I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own community in South Florida, where we had a budget of over $1 million, about 635 homes. The reason that I point that out is because I do know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, working with other volunteers, working with committees, working with vendors who are collectively serving these communities to manage the morale, manage the demographics, manage the budget, taking on all the different roles that a board member has to do. So those of you out there who are board members, I tip my hat to you. Our Association Reserves is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the country. We've been in this business now since 1986. We've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties, actually in the US and around the world. We've got offices from coast to coast. We have more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other provider. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which of course includes all types of condos and HOAs, but also timeshares and other types of residential communities. We also have a great deal of experience with other property types. So office buildings, hotels, resort properties, worship facilities, so on and so forth. One thing I do always like to point out is that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. Okay, we are not an engineering firm, we're not an accounting firm, but rather a very specific, very specialized consulting firm that's focused on doing this one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. Now, the way that we do that is by preparing those accurate and reliable reserve studies that will help our clients to forecast and budget for major projects. So if we do our job well and our clients follow the plans that we've designed for them, hopefully they're able to reduce the risk of special assessments and bank loans and other types of financial distress. If you would like any additional information about our company, about who we are, what we do, our website's down there in the bottom right-hand corner, reservestudy.com. I will also have my email address up on the screen at the end, but if you want to jot that down right now, it's wsimons, WSIMONS @reservestudy.com. All right, so in this course, this fundamentals course, we really just have two sections. We'll spend a little bit, maybe 10 minutes or so in the beginning answering the basic question of, what are reserves, legally speaking? But the majority of the class is going to talk about reserve studies and how these documents are used by community associations to make sure they're on the right track with regard to long-term planning. If you've attended this class before, and I've been teaching this for 10 plus years now, one of the more fun parts that we have always included is what we call the Hall of Shame. It was all these pictures of properties that were kind of for one reason or another, falling into disrepair. We had leaky roofs. We had, swimming pools that were, turned black because they haven't been maintained. Just, all kinds of things that have gone wrong. But given the events of this summer and the tower collapse in Surfside, we've taken that out, at least for the time being, just because we didn't feel it was appropriate to necessarily poke fun at associations that aren't doing this right. Not that it was ever meant to be mocking. But the takeaway from what we learned earlier this year in Surfside is that there is a real true consequence to not maintaining your property. I mean, that was a worst case scenario, hopefully something that we'll never ever see again. But I do think that's been a wake-up call for our industry. So only pointing that out in case you happen to have seen this before. This is a slightly more condensed version of this presentation that we normally give. All right. So this last slide before we jump into that first section, I put this in here because I think this illustrates a very common reaction, a very common mindset when it comes to long-term planning. So if you're a manager, if you're a board member, this may look a bit familiar to you. This is this reluctance to embrace the responsibility of what needs to be done, right? This guy here represents this, you know, kind of kick the can down the road sort of mentality, right? Eyes closed, fingers crossed, very pained look on his face. So if there's one message that I want everyone to remember from today's class, it's that all of us need to go out there to the communities that we work with and to help them get over this mindset, get around that, take responsibility, step up to the plate, and do what needs to be done to take care of your property. All right, first basic question for today, what are reserves? Okay. Very apropos topic to talk about this time of year, as most communities are starting to work on next year's budget. If you've been in the field for a while, this slide's going to be fairly elementary, but if you're newer to this profession or if you're not used to drafting a budget, we'll just spend a few minutes on this topic here. So basically, the budget for any community association can be categorized into two main sections. You've got your operating fund and you've got your reserve fund or funds. First, we'll talk about the operating fund. Okay, so that money is essentially there for the routine costs of running the business of the community association. These are the daily, weekly, monthly expenses for things like utilities, insurance, payroll, preventive maintenance, you know, landscaping, things like that. If you think of this budgeting process in personal terms, you might think of the operating account sort of like your own personal checking account. Okay. The operating funds are unrestricted. That means they can be spent on any bill that the association has to pay. And typically that money will be spent in the same year that it's collected. So what that means is that if the community has designed a good budget, they shouldn't really have any significant surplus or deficit end of the year. Hopefully all the money that's spent within that fiscal year, all the money that's collected in that fiscal year is spent in the same year. Now, on the other hand, we've got a reserve account. Now that money is there for the long-term expenses that the association has to pay for. Some of those expenses may not occur for 5, 10, maybe 25 years at a time, but when those things do come along, they might be some of the biggest bills the association will ever have to pay. So these reserve funds are typically going to be used for things like roof replacements, building painting and waterproofing, pavement resurfacing, many other types of projects we'll talk about later on. Some of the other differences between operating and reserve money is that reserve funds are restricted. That means once you put $1 into a reserve account, it can only be spent on specific things, not any bill, any random project the association wants to take on. Another difference is that in contrast to the operating fund, reserve money will accumulate sometimes over many years, building up an account balance until the day it needs to be spent for its intended purpose. So going back to the kind of personal finance analogy, and that way the reserve account functions more like a savings account would for an individual. This slide here has a short excerpt from the Florida statutes. Specifically, we're looking at the section of Statute 718, which talks about reserves. This is known as the Condo Statute. And what I've highlighted in red here is the portion of the text that talks about what associations must be reserving for. Now, if you look at that section, the statute requires that condo associations reserve for 3 things in particular, and then they add in this general definition at the end. Okay, so the 3 things they name specifically are roofs, painting, and paving. And then the general catch-all definition at the end is, and for any other item with a replacement cost exceeding $10,000. All right, now some of you may be wondering, why is that number $10,000? And I've been teaching this class for many years, although it's been on Zoom in the last year or two. Back in the day, I would ask people to raise their hands and tell me, who can tell me why it's $10,000? And the short answer is that we never really got to the bottom of that one. I don't know why it's 10,000. I don't know why it's not 1,000 or 25,000. My guess is that way back when they wrote the statute, the powers that be picked a number that sounded significant and said, okay, well, let's go with that. But the point is here that the $10,000 number is actually totally arbitrary. And for many associations, that number is probably much too high of a threshold to set. All right, we'll talk about this later in the class, but I think there's a more appropriate way to look at that dollar amount requirement and say, what is a financially significant number to this association, to my community? This slide here has a portion of the statute that pertains to HOAs. This is statute 720, which actually has even less to say about what you should be reserving for in a community association. So unlike the condo statute, the HOA language does not have any specific checklist of items that need to be included there. Pretty much all they say is that, hey, there are certain things that the association is responsible for, and if you don't have reserves, that can result in a special assessment. So that doesn't really give a whole lot of guidance, but the good news is that there is a much more realistic, much more thorough way to go about defining what any type of association, any type of property should be including in its reserve plan, which we'll talk about in just a little bit.
Sorry, I lost you for a second. You there?
Oh.
Hello?
I think we may have somebody that might need to hit the mute button there, but for now, just want to have everybody keep this basic definition in mind. Okay, reserve money here in this context is money that you're saving for a long period of time for major repair and replacement projects. Now, take a moment and notice what I didn't say. Okay, I did not say that you can spend reserve money on capital improvements. Okay, you're not spending reserve money on paying insurance premiums or insurance deductibles for that matter, or for any other purpose that it's not intended for. So just as a quick example, let's say you've got an association that does not have a playground, but all of the residents really want to put one in. Okay, that might be a perfectly smart, worthwhile thing to do. That might be a great asset to the community, but you can't use reserve money for that. The reason is that you're adding a new element to the association, which would not have been considered in any of your prior year budgets. So any prior reserve contributions, any money that you've already got in the bank, was not put there with the intention of spending it on this new cost, this new expense you've just introduced. Okay, so again, it might be a great thing to do, and I wouldn't tell a client not to proceed with that, but payment of that project, installing, creating this new playground out of nothing, would have to be paid for by some other means. Okay. Now going forward, once the playground is there, then that community could start reserving for, long-term replacement cycles, replacing the playground equipment, replacing the fall surface, perimeter fencing, lighting, shade structures, all that kind of stuff. Once it's there, that's something you should absolutely add to your reserve schedule, but the initial cost shouldn't be there. Okay. Like I promised, short and sweet there, we're going to switch gears and talk about reserve studies and talk about how these are used by properties when they prepare their annual budgets. Now, I want to make something real clear here. All of this material, everything I've covered up to now and that I will talk about, this is not unique to our company. These are all concepts that are coming from primarily from National Reserve Study standards. I'm going to introduce those in a little more detail here, but none of this is proprietary. All of this should be, general industry definitions, best practices, things that really everybody should be aware of here. But first, let's just talk about the definition of the term. Okay, so the definition of the word or words reserve study come from National Reserve Study standards, which have been in place now since the late 90s. Basically, they say that a reserve study is a tool. I guess you could, it's a document, but it's a tool that it does a couple of things. First, it identifies the current status of the reserve fund. And then secondly, it provides a funding plan that will give the community guidance about how to deal with future expenditures. Okay, another time to notice what I didn't say. Okay, a reserve study is not an insurance appraisal. It's not a turnover study, and it is not an engineering report. Okay, it's a very particular document that contains very specific content about the physical and financial elements of the community, but it is not meant to be a crystal ball. Okay, another point I'm kind of harping on these days, just in light of what happened in Surfside, a reserve study is sometimes characterized as being an inch deep and a mile wide. Okay, so we're capturing many different things about a property, but it is not a substitute for hiring a structural engineer to come out and x-ray your concrete and do some destructive testing to find out what's going on beneath the surface. It's not a substitute for hiring a life safety engineer to come out and evaluate your fire alarm system, your fire sprinkler system for an ELSS project. A reserve study is meant to be broad in nature. It's a financial planning document. And there's oftentimes good reason to explore things in more detail. And so a good reserve study provider should let the client know that, if there's something that requires more evaluation, more in-depth study than what we do in a reserve study, that's something that needs to be done. And once that's done, let's say you hire a marine engineer to come out and inspect your seawall, and they give you a report on its condition and the cost to replace it. By all means, work that information back into your reserve study. We will give you some general recommendations, based on other properties we've worked with or industry standards, but it is not a substitute, especially for these big ticket items like mechanical systems, concrete, elevators. Those are all things that deserve more careful analysis. And once that's done, like I said, go back to your reserve study and plug in those new numbers to make it even more specific. Okay, there are 3 types of reserve studies, and if a community has never had one done before, then it needs to start with what's called a full reserve study. So in that type of report, the provider is creating everything totally from scratch. Okay, it's going to involve a very thorough site inspection, which involves taking measurements, taking photos, gathering up all of the raw data that will be analyzed and will eventually become the component list for that property. But after you've had a full reserve study done, let's say a couple years down the road, it's time to think about one of 2 types of update studies. The first type is called an update with a site visit. In that case, a new site inspection takes place, but it's going to be based off of the existing data, really just kind of looking for any significant changes in life expectancy or cost estimates based on current conditions of the property. There are some states that require these types of updates at specific intervals, but generally speaking, the best practice is to have one done at least every 3 years or so. The last type of study is called an update with no site visit, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. Still results in a whole new reserve study document, whole new financial analysis. But in that case, instead of conducting a new inspection, now the provider will be corresponding with the board, with the property manager, to find out what projects have taken place or what new information is available since the last time anybody was on site. So a lot of properties out there will consider doing these no site visit updates in the off years, years 2 and 3 between times when somebody is coming out to that property. Okay, there are 2 parts to this process, to a reserve study. Those are called the physical analysis and the financial analysis. So in the physical analysis, that's where somebody's coming out to do that on-site visual inspection of all the common areas, looking at everything from the roof, the mechanical rooms, the amenities, lobbies, hallways, mechanical systems, anything and everything that the association is responsible for needs to be considered as part of that process. This obviously involves taking a lot of measurements and photos, but also gathering model and serial numbers for equipment, conducting research, doing whatever else it takes to gather up the raw data related to each of those components. During the physical analysis, it's usually very worthwhile to have a meeting, to have a representative from the property. That can be a board member or the whole board and or the property manager, to meet with your provider, collaborate with them, help them gain from your insights, your experience of having lived there or worked there. Typically a reserve study inspection is a day or 2, maybe a couple days at most, but it should be thought of as a collaborative process. So we absolutely welcome those meetings and those opportunities to hear from somebody about their firsthand experience there. Okay, the second part of the study is that financial analysis. This is the part that takes place back at our office, where we organize all the raw data that came in from that inspection and start to analyze it, right? We're researching particular costs or project history information, comparing what we observed to our experience working with other properties, and eventually starting to fill in some gaps and then draw some financial conclusions. What does this property have? What condition are these things in? And financially speaking, what should they need to do about those things? Which kind of segues into our 3 outcomes here. There are 3 outcomes to a reserve study, which I'll talk about one at a time. So first and foremost, the reserve study will contain a component list. And the word component in this context really just means some instance where the community is going to be spending money. So a reserve component could be a roof replacement project. It can be a swimming pool resurfacing. It can be a lobby remodel. The idea is that for each component, there are 3 key pieces of information that need to be determined. First up, we need to determine the useful life of that component. And what I mean by that term useful life is its overall lifespan. How long is it going to be in place from start to finish, either from when it was originally installed or when it was most recently replaced until that needs to be done again. The second data point, the second estimate, is its remaining useful life. Now that number is going to be determined relative to a certain point in time. So for example, let's say you've got a component with a useful life of 10 years, but as of now, as of this fiscal year, it's only 3 years old. In that case, you would say that, again, as of this fiscal year, its remaining useful life should be about 7 years. Now, lastly, we'll come up with an estimate for replacement costs. And I've been asked over the years if the word replacement really matters here. So to be clear, you don't always have to be fully replacing something to justify it as a reserve component. You could just as easily say upgrade, remodel, modernize, resurface, or something else. So, again, don't get too hung up on the word choice, but focus on the purpose of these reserve funds. It's the need to spend money to keep that component providing value to the association. Okay, so at this point you may be wondering, well, how do we determine what goes on the list? And I showed you earlier the Florida statutes and what they have to say with respect to reserve budgeting, which in short is not a whole lot. So now I'm going to give you a different approach. Okay, most professional reserve study providers will be using this 4-part test, which comes from our National Reserve Study Standards. And the beauty of this test is that it's more of an open-ended definition of what a reserve component should be. The nice thing about this is that it can be applied to any different type of community. So instead of going into a project with some kind of predetermined checklist, we go in there with our eyes open. We're looking for anything on the property that might meet this criteria. And we'll talk about these 4 parts one at a time. So the first part here is that the component in question has to be the association's responsibility. Okay, pretty straightforward. An example of something that usually fails this part of the test is often the windows and doors in a condo building. I would say that at least 95, maybe even 99% of the time, the individual unit owners are responsible for replacement of their own windows and doors. So in those cases, there's no need to include them in the funding plan and the reserve study. Similarly, in the case of an HOA where you have roads that are maintained by the city or by the county, there's no need to include any funding for road repaving, okay? The second part of the test here is that the component has to have a limited useful life. Now, in our world, we don't ever use the word forever, but if something should last indefinitely and there's no timeline where you would expect to replace it, then it's usually not something that you need to consider as part of the reserve plan. So for an example, you can think of something like the foundation of the building, the structure of the walls inside, the conduit that's serving the electrical wiring inside the walls. These are things that should last the life of the property, however long that might be. And so therefore you don't need to be actively funding for their replacement. It's more likely that some developer will knock the building down and build something new than you would ever be replacing those things. Okay, the third part of this test is maybe the most complicated, which is that the component has to have a predictable remaining useful life in order for us to include it in the reserve plan. And the key word here is predictable. To be more specific, what I mean is predictability in terms of scope and frequency. Okay, so if you can't reliably predict how much money you'll be spending on something or how often, then it's probably not a good idea to handle it through reserves. And I'm gonna touch on a key example here, which is often something that comes up in the Q&A. So many associations will ask about including the payment of an insurance deductible as part of their reserve schedule, right? The going wisdom is that this is a really big number, and we're very scared that if we have to pay this one day, it's going to be a huge burden on our association. So can we list it as a reserve component? Well, if you were me, then your response would be, okay, well, what should the useful life be in that case? In other words, how often are you going to have to pay that deductible? Which of course nobody knows. that's the whole reason we have insurance in the first place. These expenses come as a surprise. It's the result of a natural disaster, some kind of fire, hurricane, a flood. And to make some arbitrary prediction about how often that might occur is getting away from the scope of reserve planning, okay? Now, that's not to say that we don't recommend that you have some kind of plan in place. After all, this is Florida. There's always going to be more hurricanes, more storms, more issues coming on down the road. The problem is just that we don't know how often or how severe those might be. And so there's really no way for us to responsibly tell a client how often they would have to pay that out of reserves. So in those cases, normally what we'll tell them is that it might be a good idea to consider a third type of account for your association. Right? You'll have your operating account for those routine expenses we talked about in the beginning. You have your reserve account for all the components that do meet this criteria. But in addition to those, maybe it's a good idea to establish an emergency fund or an emergency line of credit, right? Something that's available to the community in the event that they need to pay that deductible or something else. It could be an emergency lawsuit that, you know, is filed against the association. But again, the problem with listing it as a reserve component is that ultimately you'll be basing some very specific funding calculations off of a timeline of expenses. And if those expenses don't fall in line with the plan, if they don't go along with the timeline, then the calculations for funding will then be thrown off, okay? Let's say you just made a wild guess. You assumed a useful life of 10 years for paying your deductible, but then you get, 3 storms in a period of 5 years, and you're expecting that the reserve account will fund for the deductible each time. Well, in reality, what happens in that case is you'll end up, much more likely to end up pulling money away from other reserve components that did have a predictable lifespan, which might result in you needing special assessments to make up for those shortfalls. All right, before we move on, the last criteria on the test here is, does this component represent a significant cost to the association? And I showed you earlier the statutory number of $10,000, but again, remember that is an arbitrary number. In our experience, for most associations, that dollar amount should be a lot lower. The advantage of doing it that way is that, yes, you will have more components listed in your reserve schedule, but the benefit to that is that it takes the pressure off of your operating budget, which would otherwise have to absorb those costs when they come along, right? These things are going to happen no matter what. It's just a matter of how you pay for them. But think about maybe a smaller community that has 6 projects that are $5,000 each. Technically speaking, if we just go by the book, they would be okay to leave those out of the reserve plan because individually the costs are less than $10,000. But let's imagine a scenario where all 6 of those things happen to occur around the same time. Well, collectively, that is now a total expense of $30,000 that they're going to have to squeeze into the operating budget for that year. And if cash flow is a little tight, that can lead to a tough situation, right? But had they listed those in the reserve plan, now they would have the ability to spend reserve money on those things, and maybe that's less disruptive to the community as a whole. Okay, so the point is, the takeaway here is that there is no one number that will be appropriate for any and all associations. Sometimes it comes up in the Q&A, what is an appropriate number? You can look at that in a number of different ways. Maybe it's a percentage of your total budget. Maybe it's a fixed dollar amount, like, $1,500 or $2,000. I'm not trying to suggest that you would reserve for things that are hundreds of dollars. Those are de minimis. Those are things that can be included in the operating budget pretty easy. But when you get into that, especially that range of, let's say, between $5,000 and $10,000, that's still a large amount of money for almost all communities. So the point is, don't just rely on $10,000 as your only requirement there. All right, on this slide here, I've drawn a little red bracket up there at the top, which is just around the top 3 components. Those are the only ones specifically mentioned by the Florida statutes. But if you look down at the rest of this list, you're going to see a lot of other things that we would routinely include in a reserve study. So, as an example, for a smaller, simpler townhome style community, it may be that there's 15 or 20 components in total on your list. But when we deal with larger properties, especially high-rise buildings, large HOAs, we very routinely have well over 100 components that are listed in the reserve study. So folks out there, if you're looking at your budget for next year and you're seeing that the list is fairly short, if there's only 5, 6, 7 things on your reserve schedule, and just from walking around the community that there's going to be a lot more to consider there, that should be a red flag to you. All right, our next outcome from a reserve study is what we call this evaluation of current reserve fund strength, which we typically describe in terms of percent funded, okay? One of the best ways that I found to explain percent funded is to use the analogy of a credit score, right? So we've all had our credit reports pulled. We all know, hopefully, what our credit scores are. To an outside party like a bank or a credit card company, your score is an indicator of what kind of risk you are. So if you think similarly, in the same way, if you think of the reserve study itself like a credit report, but you have to boil it down to one key result, then I would argue that that result is percent funded. We measure this on a 0 to 100% scale, and we consider anything between 0 and 30% funded to be a weak position. In that range, associations have a much higher likelihood of special assessments and other types of cash flow problems. But once you get above 30% funded, that's a much more moderate place to be. It's not an emergency anymore, but there's still some room for improvement. Where you really want to be is above 70% funded. That's where we've seen the lowest statistical risk of those types of problems occurring. All right, we've talked about this idea conceptually, but now let's talk about how we actually calculate percent funded. It's a pretty simple idea. Basically, we're just looking at how much money an association has at some point in time and comparing that dollar amount against how much money it should have theoretically at the same point in time. And we just divide one by the other and express that comparison as a percentage. Okay, so the first part of the calculation, pretty straightforward. When we're doing a study for a client, we're looking at their current financial statements, we're talking with their manager, and basically trying to get a look ahead to the start of the following fiscal year, right? How much money will they have at the beginning of that year? Okay, the next step is to compare that amount against how much they should have at the same point in time. Okay, now this notion, this concept of how much they should have, that is an amount that we call the fully funded balance. Okay, now I'll say it again, that fully funded balance number is theoretical. But the way I put it in perspective is to ask you a question. Okay, if I told you that there's a community out there that has $50,000 in reserves, or pick any number you like, 100,000, $2 million in reserves, but I haven't told you anything else about that community. Have I really told you anything at all, right? Is there any way to know if that's enough? And I'll hear that sort of thing all the time from board members. Somebody would say to me, we're in great shape. We have, $900,000 in reserves. And then I always kind of smile and nod and say, yeah, that sounds like a lot of money, but I have no idea if that's adequate unless we have something to compare it against, right? So again, it all depends what type of property we're talking about. A little 2-story building with no amenities, just a parking lot. It may be that 50 grand is plenty of money for them. But if I'm looking at a luxury high-rise building, those of you who have lived or worked in these types of properties, you'll know that 50 grand is a drop in the bucket. That can be wiped out in one installment of one project. All right, we're going to take this one step further here, and we'll calculate this fully funded balance. Okay, another simple idea, but here we're just looking at how old a component is compared to its overall lifespan, which gives us a fraction. I'm going to then take that fraction and multiply it by the current replacement cost of the component. That result will tell us how much money that community should have today for its eventual replacement. Now, when we do a reserve study, it doesn't matter if the community has only 4 components or 400. What we're going to do is calculate the fully funded balance for each one and then add all those numbers together, which tells us in entirety, what is the fully funded balance for this whole community right now. Once we've done that, then we have something we can use to examine their cash on hand and put that number in perspective and make a judgment. All right, so we'll do a quick example together, all right? Let's pretend that we are all collectively on the board, or we're managing this property that we'll call the Seaview condominiums, and our task is to calculate percent funded for this community as of the start of this next fiscal year. All right, we've kind of talked it through. You understand the first step here is to establish the starting reserve balance for that upcoming fiscal year. So pardon the typo there. Let's just imagine that says January 1st, 2022. And let's say that based on our cash flow and our financial statements, we're going to estimate that we start 2022 with a position of $60,000 in reserves. Okay, so keep that number in the back of your mind. The next thing that we have to do is to calculate the fully funded balance for each of the components in this property. And for the sake of this example, I'm going to limit it to just 3 things. First up, let's look at the roof. Okay, let's say that our roof is 10 years old and it has an overall lifespan of 20 years. Let's give it a replacement cost of $80,000. Okay, now keep in mind that the fully funded balance is only the proportion of the cost that we need to have on hand today. So since it's halfway through its life, we only really need to have half of the replacement cost saved up today, because of course we recognize we have another 10 years to collect the difference. So in this case, we'll take 10 over 20, multiply that by $80,000, which tells us that the theoretical fully funded balance for the roof as of right now is $40,000, right? It's halfway through its life, so this community should have half of the replacement cost saved up today. Next up, we'll do the same approach for the gym equipment. Now let's say here that the equipment is 5 years old with an overall lifespan of 15 years and a replacement cost of $30,000. In that case, we would know that the fully funded balance for that equipment today is $10,000, right? Makes sense? Again, it's a third of the way through its life. So theoretically, we only need to have a third of the replacement cost in the bank today. Last one here, we'll say that we painted the hallways of the building 2 years ago, and if we want to do that every 8 years at a cost of $100,000, we would divide 2 by 8, so it's 1/4 or 25% of the way through its life, and at that $100,000 cost estimate, we can calculate that the fully funded balance for painting is $25,000. Okay, so not so bad. We now know that we have 60 grand going into next year, and we have calculated the fully funded balances for each of our components, which will enable us to calculate percent funded for the entire community. All right, so again, we take the 40,000 for the roof, the 10,000 for the gym equipment, and the 25,000 for painting. Adding those together, we arrive at a theoretical fully funded balance total of 75,000. Okay, now that we know how much we should have, we can look back at the actual cash that we do have, the 60,000, and make a determination that this association is 80% funded. All right. So before we move on here, I want to just show you how we draw some financial conclusions about associations based on that level of percent funded. So what you're looking at on this chart here is the result of a very large internal analysis that our company did a number of years ago. We looked at a data set of thousands of associations. I think it was 10,000 studies we had done. And we measured for 2 variables. Okay, first, what was their percent funded level? Okay, and secondly, we asked a yes or no question. Did we need to include any special assessments in that funding plan? And the results were pretty obvious, pretty much what we expected we would find. But the idea was that the closer an association is to 0% funded, the lower the amount of money they have, the higher the chances they needed very large or very immediate special assessments. The good news is that that risk drops dramatically. Okay, once you get above 30% funded, it was only about 10% of the time that we were recommending an immediate special assessment. So, and then looking further, of course, once you get to 70% or above, very, very rare that a community needs special assessments at that point in time. A couple years later, we did another internal study, this time looking at the relationship between percent funded and property value. Okay, so the way we did this one was to look at a large data set again. This time it was, I think, maybe 200 or so communities, hundreds of properties in one metropolitan area. So we used kind of the greater Los Angeles, California area. And we looked at a group of properties that were all as similar as they could be in terms of their size, their age, number of units, amenities, and so on and so forth. We then measured the appraised market value of the homes in those communities, wanting to see what difference it makes when the associations themselves are in a better financial position. So again, to be specific, What we wanted to know is there an increase in property value when we see an increase in percent funded? Okay. So the first thing we did was to set a baseline, right? Let's look at communities that are in a weak position, 0 to 30% funded, and let's look at the dollars per square foot property value of those homes, okay? What then happens when we look at similar communities, but they're in a fair position, 30 to 70% funded? And then again, for those that are 70% funded and above. And again, all else being as equal as possible, what we found is that the communities that were in a fair position had property value about 8% higher than the ones that were in the weak position. And the ones that were in a strong position, above 70%, were almost a 13% dollar per square foot value higher than their weak counterparts, okay? So, you know, if you kind of think about that for a moment, you can see why that would be why that might be the case. Those that have money in the bank tend to have better curb appeal, right? They don't let things slide. They're in better physical condition, which means they're more attractive to potential buyers. So if you think of one of the kind of fundamental questions here, why have reserves at all? Why is this stuff important? One answer can be that it does actually translate at some point into a correlation, right? There is a measurable gain in property value for communities that are doing this correctly. Okay, one last outcome, and then we'll kind of bring this in for a close. The third and final thing you get from a reserve study is the funding plan. Now, if you think about the first two things, we talked about the component list, which is essentially the definition or the framework of what you're reserving for. And then we talked about percent funded. That tells us where the community stands as of now, as of this point in time. But once you've identified those two things, the last question on the table is, well, where do you go from here? And that's where your funding plan comes in. So one of the first things that we do when we're designing these plans is to look at the current budget. And the first thing we test is, you know, what happens if the client just stays with their current plan? What happens if they just maintain their current trajectory, if you will, given their future expenditures? Is that going to be enough? And if it's clear that the existing plan is not going to be enough, then there's going to need to be some changes made, okay? Couple of the other points I make here is that the funding of reserves needs to be consistent with the timing of your overall assessments. So for example, if you have monthly dues paid to the association, there needs to be a monthly reserve contribution. I believe by law that has to be within 30 days. In other words, what I'm saying is that you can't just operate throughout the year hoping that at the end of the year, you'll have some kind of surplus, a little bit extra left in your operating account, which you can transfer into reserves and say, hey, we funded our reserves this year. It doesn't work that way. It needs to be a proactive plan. And the last point to make on this slide is that in the cases where the historical contribution rate is not sufficient, and if that community is in bad shape, unfortunately, there oftentimes will be the need for an initial special assessment part of that plan. In those cases, I always point out that, look, you should think of this special assessment as a catch-up contribution. It's being required to make up for all the years when your budget did not have adequate reserves in it. There's some final principles we'll talk about that we consider when we're designing these funding plans. We'll talk about these ones individually. First and foremost, as you look to the future and you model your reserve expenditures over time, at the bare minimum, the amount of money that you put into reserves over that period of time has to ensure that you have some available cash on hand. That is the bare minimum requirement, which is something we call baseline funding. I talk about that in a lot more detail in another class I teach called reserve funding methodologies. But basically, it's a simple idea. If you don't have any money in reserves, you're guaranteed to have special assessments or loans. And that's one of the things we're trying to avoid or prevent in the first place. The contribution to reserves should also be stable. So what that means is that, for example, you can't have these big, huge spikes and decreases in the contribution rate based on arbitrary fluctuations. Okay, it's not fair to assume that some future group of owners will be perfectly willing and able to double their reserve contributions overnight, making it a lot easier on the people who live there today. Okay, you're not allowed to plug in any balloon contributions either. So for example, if you've got, let's say, $1 million roof replacement project, but it's not happening for another 10 years, you can't just operate with the expectation that you'll raise $950,000 in year 9 and avoid putting away any meaningful contributions between now and then, okay? You also don't take years off. So for example, if you've spent a large amount of money modernizing your elevators and you don't have to do that again for another 20, 25 years, that doesn't mean that you stop funding reserves for elevator modernization. That's a cyclical project. It will happen again, and you should begin funding for the next time around as early as possible so as to spread the cost of the component over the longest period of time that you can. The idea there is that the association membership should be paying for the deterioration of the components over their entire useful life, not just all at once, right when something breaks. Okay, that way everyone pays their fair share, and it's not just the unlucky people who happen to live in a property when the life expectancy for something expires, right? That's like playing musical chairs when we're kids. We're not, that is not the goal of your budget. Okay, it's my last slide before we open it up for Q&A here, but a couple important things to talk about. Maybe the most important principle to follow when we're designing these reserve funding plans is that it has to be fiscally responsible. What does that mean? That means being realistic with respect to interest and inflation, okay? It is not realistic to assume that you can earn 10% interest each year on your reserve funds. Unfortunately, we know that reserve money can't be invested in anything very exciting. So that means you should be assuming a fairly low return on that money. With respect to inflation, you should also be realistic there. What we found is that through historical data trends, if you look at this over a long enough period of time, the average annual inflation rate tends to be about 3%. Okay, from any one year to the next, it can be 0 or 1 or 2 or 5, but over a long-term period of time, we're talking about an average annual rate of about 3% from one year to the next. What that means is that if you are assuming that the cost of a project 15 years from now will be the same as what it cost you today, you're going to be way off. Okay, your plan just will not work. The second point on the slide here speaks to being honest about the situation that you're in. If the association has not historically done a good job of funding reserves, it's time to address that. Okay, it is financially irresponsible to continue operating the way that you always have just to maintain some status quo. Okay, it is not the job of the board of directors to make owners happy. It is not their job to keep the dues low compared to the building or the community down the street. Okay, speaking of the owners, the reserve funding plan cannot be biased in favor of the people who live there now at the expense of the people who will live there later on. You can't assume that they'll just pick up the tab for you. Okay, now lastly, this all takes place despite what may have happened up to now. And we see this all the time. Prior budgets were not funding reserves. The associations had the can kicked to them. That is not an excuse to kick the can on down the road for the next group, okay? In a perfect world, all associations would have been carefully managed and guided over the years to a stable position, but in reality, that's usually not the case. However, that does not in any way remove the obligation from the board of directors to act responsibly and fulfill their fiduciary duty. Now, having said all that, at the end of the day, I recognize that this is a challenge for most communities. If the community has not been operating with healthy reserves for some number of years, there's a good chance they'll be in a financial hole that's going to be tough to climb out of. But we have to be honest about that, right? The owners in those communities deserve to make an informed decision. We think that having a reserve study done is one helpful way to make that possible. They need to know that if the reserves aren't funded properly, then the only logical conclusion will be special assessments and loans when things need to get done. Because remember, there is no option to do nothing. This work will happen one way or another. So again, remember the guy we talked about in the beginning, the gentleman with his eyes closed, his fingers crossed, you know, the pained look on his face, just hoping for the best. If I've done any good here today, hopefully you'll agree that that mindset is not a substitute for a responsible plan. And with that, I will say that I've hoped everybody got some good information today. We're going to open this up for Q&A, and we'll take it from there.
Wonderful. Excellent job as usual. And before I read you that first question, you can see them too, Will, I believe.
Yeah, I'm going to, let's see.
Yeah, I'll just, while Will's looking through them, I'll just briefly mention that the slides, for those of you who might have joined a little bit late, the slides will be available, as will the recording of this video, on cargforhelp.org within a few days from now. So be on the lookout for that. And we'll also send out an email to everybody to let them know that they're online at the opportune same time.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, question here says, my association has never had reserves. Is it possible to establish partial reserves with the goal to have full reserves within 3 to 5 years? Yes, absolutely. Something is better than nothing. If your community is starting from zero or starting from a very low position, it's very, very unlikely you're going to go from 0 to 100% funded overnight. In fact, that's nearly impossible. When we deal with a client that's in a weak position now, the idea is to gradually, eventually get them to a strong position, right? The next 3 to 5 years will be crucial. Of course, you want to do as much as you can aggressively in the early part of the plan, particularly if there are major expenses coming up right away. But yeah, you can certainly chip away at this. I think it's an unfair burden on a community if they've gone for a couple of decades without any reserve money, and then are expected to bring it to 100% right away. That's not really fair, but you should try to get there as quickly as you can. So yeah, within 3 to 5 years would be a good goal. I guess the only caveat there is make sure that you're looking at your timeline of expenses. Any components that have a very short life expectancy, maybe focus on those initially, and maybe make your secondary goal to just generally build up an account there. Okay, another question here. Please explain again what restrictive means for the reserve fund spending. Does it need to be spent from the category it's in? Now that kind of gets into another topic, which is a subject I talk about in my other course, which is the difference between straight line reserves and pooled reserves. But just in general, the first part of your question here, restricted means that when you put money into a reserve account, it can only be spent for major repairs and replacements of particular physical components of the property. If you have straight line reserves, in which case you have a roof reserve account, you have an elevator account, you have a swimming pool account, that does imply a further level of restriction. So in those cases, you've got money that's dedicated for one particular asset, which can only be spent on that asset unless the owners in the community vote to approve its use for something else. So if you've got a ton of money sitting in an elevator account, but you've got a roof project that needs to be happening much sooner, you can technically move money from elevator to roofing if the owners approve the use of that fund. So hopefully that helps cover that one. Let's see, if you want to replace pool furniture and the money for it is not in the reserves, how is it done? Using operating fund only? Yes, yeah, basically that's it. It's either, I guess you could say a small special assessment, but in that case, it would be the operating fund, yeah. In cases where there's a true emergency, like, a hurricane comes through and there's a bunch of damaged landscaping that needs to be replaced, that's when you may be able to look to a line of credit or a loan. But yeah, generally speaking, if it's not listed in reserves, operating is the only other place that it could be done. Okay, let's see. Can the board use reserves to purchase a condo unit to generate rental income? Wow. In 13 years, I don't think I've ever gotten that question. That's an interesting one. I don't believe they could. To purchase a condo unit is not a repair, a replacement, a modernization of some existing part of the property. That's, that's not what that money is there for. Having said that, maybe it's a good idea. I mean, if there is an excess of cash in the operating account one year, and the association wants to buy a vacant unit within its own property to generate some income. I'm kind of veering out of my lane here, and I'm not quite sure the legality of that, but I'm pretty confident in saying that should not be a reserve expense, but maybe an interesting idea. Let's see, next up here, can you explain when it is necessary to take an entire condo association membership vote to accept the reserve study? Interesting. Okay, so I think what you might be talking about here is proposing a budget that includes the funding of reserves, or I should say that it wants to do less than the required amount of funding. So first and foremost, a reserve study does not need to be accepted by anybody. There is no formal acceptance of the document by the board or the membership that needs to take place. It is just professional guidance. In theory, a board could totally disregard the reserve study and come up with their own reserve schedule and come up with the calculations to fund according to that schedule all by themselves. That would not require any input or any response from us or anything like that. When a condo needs to vote to approve funding of reserves, that typically means that they're wanting to do less than is required to fully fund their reserves. So if I'll just give you an example, let's say that the reserve schedule says, okay, based on the list of things that are here and their life expectancies and costs, the amount of funding that would be required is $100,000 this year. And the members all say, no, we're not in favor of that. It's gonna hit my pocketbook too hard. We're okay with, $40,000 for reserves. In that case, it's not an entire association that needs to vote. I believe it's just a majority of a quorum. Now here's where I say I'm not an attorney and to check your governing documents to see if there's any other requirements there, but generally speaking, anytime you're proposing to do less than full funding is when the ownership has to vote. Otherwise, the default setting, if you will, the amount that goes into the budget is the amount required for fully funding of reserves. So I hope that answers, but if not, send me an email. By the way, I'm going to do my best. I haven't read any of these questions in advance, so I'm doing all this off the top of my head, but if I don't quite capture it, I would encourage you to check out our website again or talk to some of the other sponsors, the other partners here with CARG. They may have expertise that I'm not aware of here. All right, great question here. Do you recommend including inflation in a reserve schedule? I'm going to give you a short answer and a long answer, okay? So the short answer is absolutely inflation needs to be part of reserve planning. For many, many years, for 35 years as a company, we always included inflation in our reserve studies. What we have come up against lately within the last, really just within the last year, it's come to a head, is that there is one section of the Florida Administrative Code that talks about the prohibition against balloon payments in a reserve funding plan, meaning that, well, I should say their interpretation of that is that any increase whatsoever from one year to the next in the form of reserve contributions constitutes a balloon payment. So for example, if I told a client, $50,000 this year, but then, $52,000 next year and $54,000 the year after because costs are increasing with inflation, the DBPR has said, no, that's not allowed. We want to see a flat level contribution rate from one year to the next. Now, the problem that we run into is that if I'm increasing costs, right? If I'm increasing expenditures for the association due to inflation, which I agree is realistic, but I'm not allowed to increase the income to reserves, the amount going into that account to help pay for those rising costs, that creates a very large imbalance, especially as it plays out over time. So in response to that, and with a lot of heavy disclaimers this year, us and other reserve study providers, which some of whom have been doing even longer, have removed inflation from the reserve study. Now, I do not at all want to give anybody the impression that that is our choice or our preference or a responsible thing to do. In reality, what needs to happen in those cases is that the reserve study needs to be updated from one year to the next. The costs can be inflated during that update process, and a new contribution rate can be proposed each year in successive years. So yeah, it's a very complicated situation. I've talked with some of our competitors about this. There's rumblings and whispers that possibly this may change in the near future, and we will go back to including including inflation in our studies as we always have. For now, the only reason we would or anybody would take that out is to balance out that requirement to have a level contribution rate to reserves. So tricky question there. I spend a lot of time talking about this in my reserve funding methodologies class. If anybody's interested in that, I do have recordings of that on on YouTube. So I'd be happy to send out a link to that if anyone's interested, where I get into that in a lot more detail. Okay, last question is here. Can we have an example of a condo web page where the financial balance and percent funded is shown? I'm not sure I understand the question there. I mean, we do have a lot of content on our website that shows, sample reserve studies and shows some of the charts and things that I showed here in the class that kind of explain in more detail the relationship between percent funded and special assessment risk and things like that. But I'm not sure if that totally captures that question. So I apologize if I'm misreading that, but I think that's all we've got for now, Jeff. If there's anybody else that has questions, feel free to email me, but I'll kick it back to the group.
Yeah, thanks. I'll elaborate briefly on that before I kick it over to Mark. And Will, hang on for just a second longer, please.
Sure.
With association websites, condominiums, by law, if there are 150 units or more in the association, have to have a website. That particular website is for owner access, password protected owner access for owners to go into the back end and see what's happening. So for that reason, it's really not all that common to be able to give everybody an example of what something like that looks like. But envision having a username and a password. If you live in a condominium that has a website, you log in, you go to the back end, and that's where you would see the financial summaries that is required to be posted onto the website with regards to the legislative statutes. So I hope that clarifies a little bit. We really can't show anybody the back end of condominium X, really. So
yeah, it's a matter of sensitivity and privacy. I mean, I do think that more transparency is good, and I think that there may be some provisions for potential buyers. If somebody's wanting to buy into a community, they should be entitled to get financial statements and things. But yeah, generally speaking, that's not meant to be public information. But we do have kind of some studies and guides on our website that may be helpful to you there.
okay, and Roberto, if you want to know more about association websites, put that in the survey and I can help you out there after the meeting. Mark, Will's going to hang on for a minute because I want him to relay one more time how they can reach him. Folks, hang on for a little while longer because we're going to end the webinar, and that's when, after we end the webinar, is when you will get the brief survey, which is what we need to get your course credit information over to Will. Mark, back to you for a brief little bit more about CARG and some of the members we have on with us today.
All right. Well, thanks, Jeff. Will, I wanted to just thank you. I've been doing condominium accounting for about 20 years, and I will definitely be using your presentation to explain reserves because you've done really a phenomenal job.
Thank you.
With that said, we have a few members that joined us from CARG. Any questions that you may have concerning banking or landscaping, pest control, pool maintenance, janitorial like maintenance or accounting, you can go ahead and write those in. We will go ahead and answer that. While people are doing that, what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and just turn it over to Terry Russo, who is muted right now. I surprised her. She's with South State, formerly Center State Bank. She's the loan officer, the go-to person when you need loans. So Terry, if you just want to just give a very brief introduction,
Sure,
and we'll wait for any questions that come up.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Terry Russo. And as Mark said, I'm with South State Bank. I do the association lending for the bank. And as Will mentioned in his presentation, the associations can do lines of credit and have those in place for those items that come up that you don't have the reserves for. I just wanted to briefly say hello, and I hope you enjoyed the class.
All right, great. Terry, there was one question that came up talking about contingency lines of credit. Maybe you can just explain.
Yeah, that's what the line of credit is. We put the line, the association can pick the amount that they want, but we like them to look at what their goal is so that they come into the bank for that loan amount, because a lot of times they don't have the reserves for their insurance deductibles. And since it's hurricane season, it's always a good idea to be able to get your hands on money if you have to have trees removed from parking lots, et cetera. Lines are in place for 2 years and come up for renewal, and they can stay in place forever as long as you want to renew them for the couple years.
All right, because I know that I go ahead and I explain that really to a lot of my clients. they can actually save money because if they increase their insurance deductible percentage and is covered by the contingency line of credit, God willing, we don't have hurricanes or any other natural disasters, you
Correct.
can go ahead and save quite a bit each year from the insurance deductible and still be protected with a line of credit, a contingency line of credit. So thank you, Terry, for that.
Thank you.
Charles, I think that you may be able to sign on or at least speak.
I do,
concerning
but I think Jeff
landscaping.
has the video blocked.
Okay, that's fine. You can just speak, Charles, just about your services for landscaping.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Infantino. I'm one of the partners here at GRC Services. GRC Services is a full-service lawn maintenance, irrigation, tree trimming, and pest control company servicing the Tri-County area. We have a local office here in Davie at the 595 truck stop and a second office in Lake Worth to service our Palm Beach County clients. So if I can be of assistance with any tree trimming or anybody needs any information regarding maintenance on their property, I'll be more than happy to come out and take a look at your property. Again, my name is Charles with GRC Services.
And Charles, there was one question about tree trimming as far as major cut and minor cut. Usually you alternate it, and they were just asking for your advice on that.
Well, that's true. The normal tree trimming is what we call pre-hurricane tree trimming, where we have to actually go up through the base of the trunk of the tree, up through the center, and open up the canopy so that air can flow from the bottom through the tree up and be released through the canopy. That is a normal tree trimming application. The major tree trimming is when you actually have to do a canopy reduction, and according to regulations that we have to follow, we cannot take more than a 25% canopy reduction, but generally a canopy reduction on your large hardwoods is usually done every 2 to 3 years, where the monthly or the annual tree trimming is done annually.
Thank you, Charles, for that. And Charles is with GRC Landscaping. Craig, if you can unmute and maybe just tell a little about, your company.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Craig Saxner. I'm the owner of Professional Building Services. We're a full-service janitorial light maintenance company serving the Tri-County area, and we're actually celebrating our 40th year in business, and we specialize in condominium and homeowners associations.
Oh, terrific. So you started out when you were about 2 years old.
Exactly. How'd you know?
And Craig, I know a lot of the clients with me, they like that one-stop situation. So can you just tell us just a little about, in addition to the janitorial, there's a question as far as, what constitutes light maintenance, so that they can make one phone call and you can handle it.
Right. The light maintenance aspect of our business consists of sorry, Jeremy.
Hear you. Well, now you're fading in and out. Technical difficulties. Technology is wonderful when it works.
Projects that we don't need to repair. Some of the other maintenance. Hear me?
Yeah, well, you're being choppy a little. But I guess if anyone has any questions for Craig from Professional Services about janitorial or light maintenance, you can contact CARG and we'll get that over to Craig.
Thanks, Mark.
I know that Leah from the pool service is, she's driving right now, but I think that Jeff, I think you had a little information that you can share from Leah.
Yeah, Leah, owner of Ava Clear Pool, she's actually handling a 911 with a client right now, which is what she would offer to all of you if you worked with her with regards to her pool services. And she wants to let everybody know that she has an offer if anybody's interested. They do weekly maintenance, perform all repairs, leak detections, replacements, and offer all backyard renovations such as diamond bright resurfacing, pavers, travertine, or concrete, coping and tile replacements. She also specializes in community associations, so it's not as well as homes, in an HOA within an association. You can contact her via email or directly via phone, which is available on cargforhelp.org. They have 24/7 customer service answering, and many discounts available at this time. So you could also inquire about services with AvaClear with the very brief survey that will appear when we end the webinar.
Terrific. Well, thank you for that. Before I introduce some of the other people that's on our panel that are not with us right now, again, my name is Mark Buckhalter with a Consult. We've been doing condominium and association accounting for the last 20 years. We do monthly accounting. We do not do any auditing. If anyone has any questions, I know budget season is coming up right now. If they have any questions concerning budget, there's absolutely no cost, no obligation to talk to me. You can contact us through the website, or you can call our phone number at 954-739-0310. I'd be more than happy to help you or assist you or guide you with the budgets or any other financial needs. And just so that we can just tell you about some of the other people that were not able to join us from the group, we do have cable consultants, and that person has a wealth of knowledge for your cable services. Usually they can go ahead and get you either better rates or better services. And they've been doing it for quite some time. There's a ServPro with the hurricanes coming up. Obviously, it's something you should all be keeping the information right on your refrigerator door or on your desk, because you never know when that leak will happen and you need somebody in an emergency. They are part of a national organization, but they give very personalized attention because it's all franchised out. Then we have Brandon Levy from Legacy Insurance, and I would say that probably 90 or 95% of his business and his expertise is definitely for associations. Even though insurance basically is regulated, it's really the service that an individual will give you when the need arises. We have also paving and seal coating and paving. So if you have any needs for that, please give us a call. We have a public adjuster. And again, with hurricanes coming up or any other kind of damages that's caused to your association, before you sign off, you really should go ahead and contact Catherine at United Claim Services. She can really assist you and probably get you more money than you realize that you're even entitled to. We have Paul Baines Roofing. That's one of our members. And then we just have a new member that went ahead and joined us, which is Pest Control, and that's Forever Gone, and that's Darren. And last but not least is Jeff, that was moderating with me. He's just a great go-to person for marketing, for webinars, for Zoom calls, really for a lot of consultations that the management companies might have a need for, and even the board members. With that said, I'm going to turn that back over to Jeff just to do a wrap up. Again, I thank everybody, and in light of everything that's going on with COVID, please stay safe.
Well, thank you, Mark. And one last time, I see Will, you hung in there. Thanks once again. Last time, can you tell the best way for everybody to reach you before we sign off?
Yeah, real simple. Thanks, Jeff. Reservestudy.com. That's our website. That's got everything you need. If anybody is looking for a proposal for a reserve study, we have a tool right there on the home page up in the upper right corner, if memory serves, that you can use to submit a request. These days, we're getting pretty much towards the end of the line in terms of budget season for this year, although we are still taking on some new projects. But looking ahead to next year, we do a promotion each year, which we call our Smart Start program, which is a 10% discount on our fees if we do the study between January and March, which is normally our slow season. So if it may be too late to do a study this year for your community, but you still want to get something going, by all means, contact us, and we'll be able to send you a proposal now that shows that discounted price for next year as well. Otherwise, thank you again, and always a pleasure. Thanks, Jeff.